The channel stayed open for 11 seconds after the screaming stopped. 4.2 kilometers of hull slid through the dark like a moving coastline, and the Karath fleet did not fire on it. They didn't know what it was. Admiral Serafina Vosgale watched the tactical display go white at the edges, the way ice does right before it cracks. 240 Karath warships sat in perfect formation across the Kethar corridor, layered 3 deep, exactly the way 3 centuries of doctrine said they should. She had spent 11 days teaching them that the formation was already broken. They just hadn't noticed yet. "Fire control locked," Captain Okafor said. His voice didn't shake. It hadn't shaken in 6 years of waiting for this exact sentence. Vosgale's thumb found the spine of the journal in her coat pocket. She didn't take it out. She just needed to feel it there, a weight against the numbers scrolling past on the screen. 22 ships, 4 months. Somewhere in the black ahead of her, a species that had never lost a war was about to learn what it felt like to be unaccounted for. "Vindicator," she said into the fleet channel. "Hold until my mark." The ship did not announce itself with weapons fire. It announced itself by existing. Something that size shouldn't move that quietly. On the Karath side of the corridor, 3 compound eyes tracked a return that matched no signature in any archive, and Supreme Commander Varathkor felt his crest patterns shift colors he hadn't chosen. "Identify the contact," he said. His sensor officer's antennae flattened. "Unable, Commander. Drive signature unknown. Mass estimate." A pause. "The mass estimate keeps changing." Vosgale watched the range close. Somewhere behind her, on 100 other bridges, 92,000 people were about to find out whether 11 days of planning had been enough. She said, "Mark." The Vindicator fired. "I won't tell you it ended clean. I won't tell you it ended the way anyone expected, not even her. But I can tell you this. By the time the light from that first discharge reached the edge of the corridor, the number on her screen had already started changing, and it would not stop changing for 22 minutes. 4 months earlier, the last transmission from the colony Transport Horizon's promise lasted 11 seconds. No mayday, no coordinates, just the sound of people who had run out of time for words, and then nothing at all. Admiral Vosgale read the transcript standing up in a hallway outside the UEDC command hub because she hadn't made it to her office yet. She read it twice. Then she folded the printout once, put it in her coat, and walked into General Webb's office without knocking. 22 ships, she said. 4 months, not one distress call that made it through clean. The Karath sealed that corridor and they've offered no explanation for any of it. Webb didn't look up from his desk right away. When he did, his face had the careful stillness of a man who already knew what she was going to ask for. "You want authorization." "I want the corridor back, and I want them to understand exactly why it's ours again." "The Karath have 240 warships in that sector, Admiral. 3 centuries of undefeated doctrine. You'd be committing the 7th and 3rd fleets against odds that—" "I'm not bringing the 7th and 3rd fleets." She set a data slate on his desk. "I want the Vindicator pulled from reserve." Webb was quiet for a long moment. The Vindicator had sat in dry dock for 2 years, a 4.2-kilometer question mark that Congress had stopped funding and nobody had officially cancelled. 6 years of engineering, and it had never fired a shot at anything that could shoot back. "That ship has never seen combat," Webb said. "Neither has anyone who might have to fight it," Vosgale said. "That's the point." He signed the authorization 20 minutes later. She didn't smile when he did. She had learned a long time ago that smiling at the start of something like this meant you hadn't thought hard enough about the middle of it. That night, alone in her quarters, she opened the passenger manifest from the Horizon's promise. 4,153 names, civilian registry, families traveling out to the expansion colonies because the corridor used to be safe. She read every name. She always read every name. It was slower than reading a casualty count, and she had never once regretted the extra hours it cost her. She took out the journal, worn black leather, the spine cracked soft from years of the same motion, and began to write. Not a list, not a form. A sentence or two for each person, something true and specific, the kind of detail a form letter would never carry. It took her until 300. She wrote until her hand ached, and then she wrote a little more. In the morning, a petty officer knocked and asked if she wanted coffee. Yes, she said. Bring 2 cups. The petty officer hesitated. Ma'am. The Vindicator hasn't arrived at Kestrel yet, but the captain's going to need one when he finds out what I'm about to ask him to do. Waypoint Kestrel filled up slowly, the way a harbor does before a storm everyone's pretending not to watch the sky for. The 7th Fleet arrived first, 43 destroyers and frigates sliding into formation with the unhurried precision of ships that had run this exact exercise 100 times before, except this time nobody was calling it an exercise. Then the 3rd Fleet, 28 heavy cruisers, their hulls still carrying the pale scarring of the last skirmish nobody back home had heard about. Then the experimental division, 8 ships that didn't look like they belonged to any fleet at all, humming with hardware nobody outside a clearance room had a name for. The Vindicator arrived last. It came in dark, running lights cut, its hull built from a material that ate radar instead of reflecting it. 4.2 kilometers of it slid past the assembled fleet like a moving coastline, and for a long moment the comm channels across every ship in the formation went completely silent. Somebody, somewhere on the 7th Fleet's flagship, finally said what everyone was thinking. That thing is its own horizon. Vosgale watched it dock from the observation deck of her flagship, the Meridian, journal in her coat pocket, coffee going cold in her hand. Commander Reyes stood beside her, reading her the way he always did, not her words, her silences. You've been running simulations for 11 days straight, he said. 11 days is what it took the Karath to build a doctrine assuming ships only come in the sizes they've already catalogued. She didn't look away from the display. The thing they haven't anticipated is that their doctrine is built entirely on information they already have. We built something that doesn't exist in any file they own. And if it doesn't work, then 22 ships and 4 months of silence become the opening chapter instead of the whole story. She finally turned to him. It's going to work, Commander, because they're going to do exactly what a fleet with an undefeated doctrine always does. They're going to trust the pattern. Fleet exercises had been routine for 11 years. The Karath had been a manageable tension for almost as long, territorial friction at the edges, nothing that couldn't be smoothed over in a diplomatic cable. Until 4 months ago, when the corridor went quiet and stayed quiet, and 22 ships' worth of people simply stopped existing without anyone ever explaining why. Captain Okafor met her on the Vindicator's bridge 2 hours later. He was younger than the ship deserved, and he'd waited 6 years for a war he'd hoped would never actually need what he'd built. Admiral, he said, she's ready, for whatever that's worth against 240 ships. It's worth exactly this, Vosgale said, and set the coffee down in front of him. I need you to fire weapons that have never been tested against a living target at my mark, and not 1 second before. Can you do that? Okafor looked at his ship's schematic. The long silhouette of something built for a war nobody had wanted to admit was already starting. Yes, Admiral, he said. I've been ready for 6 years. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She didn't smile, but she nodded once, the way she nodded at things that were finally, after 11 days, no longer theoretical. The fleet left Kestrel at 600, no fanfare, no formation flourish, just 79 ships and one impossible shape sliding into the dark in the order she drilled into every captain twice over. Vosgale stood on the Meridian's bridge and watched the display fill with the long green line of her own fleet, and behind it, trailing at a distance that made her chest tight every time she checked it, the Vindicator's transponder ghost. All ships report ready for corridor transit, Ray said. Then let's go find out what's been eating our people, she said. The Kethar corridor didn't look like a killing ground. That was the trouble with it. 14 light-years of navigable dark between 2 collapsed stellar nurseries, the fastest road humanity had to the outer colonies, and for 11 years it had been nothing but empty space and the occasional trade conv. She'd flown through it herself, twice, back when it was just a corridor and not a word people said carefully. Her fleet crossed the threshold at 800 ship time. Sensors lit up within minutes. Contact, the sensor officer called. Multiple contacts. They've had a picket line waiting the whole time. Vosgale leaned toward the display. 60 ships, fast attack configuration, sitting exactly where her simulation said an outer picket would sit if the Karath were as confident as 3 centuries of undefeated doctrine made them. Good, she said. Send in the 7th. 43 destroyers and frigates pushed forward into the corridor's throat, drawing fire the way bait is supposed to draw fire. She watched the first hits land on her own ships and made herself keep watching. That was the cost of the plan. The first row always took the pressure. She'd written that sentence in a report 11 days ago, and it had felt like arithmetic then. It didn't feel like arithmetic now, watching the Corinth take a hit across her forward shield array and hold formation anyway. She needs this to look real, Vosgale said quietly, mostly to herself. He needs to believe this is the fight he planned for. On the other side of the corridor, Supreme Commander Varathkor watched the same engagement from a command harness that fed the battle directly into the base of his skull, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, felt something close to satisfaction. 43 human ships pushing into a picket line his doctrine had positioned exactly 11 days ago. The models were holding. The models always held. His crest patterns shifted a warm, steady gold. The color his crew had learned meant confidence, meant proceed. Second wave, he said. Advance and press the flank. Their forward line is already buckling. His sensor officer's antennae dipped in acknowledgement, and 160 warships began to move, committing the bulk of the Karath main force into a corridor his doctrine assured him was already won. He had fought 47 engagements in 3 centuries of Karath expansion. He had never lost one. There was no data anywhere in his archive suggesting today would be different, and Varathkor did not believe in things his data did not support. Vosgale watched the second wave commit on her display and felt the tight place in her chest ease by exactly 1 degree. There it is, Ray said. He's all in. Not yet, he isn't. She keyed the fleet channel, voice level, the way it always was right before the part of the plan she'd spent 6 days proving the charts were wrong about. Third Fleet. Execute. 28 heavy cruisers, hidden for 4 days inside a dust cloud that every navigational chart in Karath archives listed as non-navigable, emerged at knife range on the flank of the advancing Karath second wave. The formation that had held for 3 centuries fractured, not collapsed, not yet, but fractured, every Karath captain suddenly processing a threat their doctrine said could not exist in that position. On the corridor's far side, Varathkor's crest went the color of cold water. His sensor officer's voice cracked for the first time in the engagement. Commander, flanking contact, 28 heavy cruisers, point of origin unlisted in any survey. Reform, Varathkor said. Pull the second wave back to secondary positions, immediately. Order given, order obeyed. And exactly as Vosgale had known it would, 160 ships began the single most dangerous maneuver a fleet can execute under fire. A coordinated withdrawal, every ship's flank exposed for the seconds it took to turn. Now, she said, experimental division, disruptor arrays full spread. The 8 strange ships that had sat apart from the rest of the fleet, since Kestrel came alive with a hum nobody outside a clearance room had a name for, and the Karath fleet's communication net didn't degrade. It simply stopped. 240 ships had been one fleet, coordinated by faster-than-light relay, moving as a single mind with 240 bodies. In the space of 11 seconds, they became 240 individual actors, each one alone in a combat environment designed by a woman who had spent 11 days thinking about exactly this moment. A fleet that cannot communicate is not a fleet, Vosgale said, watching the Karath formation scatter into confused, isolated clusters. It's a scattering. Reyes looked up from his console, and for once his voice wasn't steady. Admiral, their casualties are already climbing past anything we modeled. Do you want to call it here? She didn't answer right away. Somewhere in that scattering formation were people who had never once considered that their doctrine could fail, and she found she didn't hate them the way she'd expected to. She just needed them to stop. No, she said, not yet, one more piece. Varathkor's harness fed him casualty reports faster than he could process them. Ship after ship going dark on a grid that had never gone dark in 3 centuries of Karath expansion. His crest cycled through colors his own crew had no name for, because he had never needed them before. Communications, he asked. Gone, Commander, all relay. We can't coordinate the fleet. We can barely coordinate this ship. He looked at the tactical plot. No longer a formation, just scattered points of light drifting apart from each other, each captain making decisions alone for the first time in living memory. Then signal every ship still capable of independent maneuver, he said. Fall back to the second defensive line. Regroup at. The sensor officer's antennae went rigid. Commander, new contact, bearing, a pause that lasted too long. It's not moving like a ship. Varathkor turned toward the display, and for the first time in 47 engagements, felt a shape settle into his chest that he did not have a word for in any Karath language. 4.2 kilometers of hull, running dark, closing at a speed his sensors kept revising downward as if the mass itself refused to be measured. Identify it, he said. I can't, Commander. There's nothing in the archive that. Then identify what it is not. The sensor officer was quiet for a long moment. It's not anything we've ever fought before. The Karath fleet was no longer a fleet. It was 240 separate decisions, each one made by a captain who had never in his life had to make a decision alone, and every one of those decisions was the wrong one. Vosgale watched the scattered formation drift apart on her display and felt the tight place in her chest wind tighter instead of looser. This was the part of the plan that had kept her awake the most nights, not the firing, the waiting before it. Range to primary contact, she said. Closing, Reyes answered. He's not running. He's trying to figure out what to run from. On the far side of the corridor, Varathkor's harness fed him a stream of casualty reports he had stopped being able to process as individual losses. They had become a single number, climbing, and for 3 centuries that number had never climbed against a Karath fleet in an engagement he commanded. Recall the fast attack squadrons, he said. Consolidate on my position. We regroup as one body. His sensor officer's voice was thin. Commander, half of them can't hear the order. The relay network is gone. Then repeat it on every channel we have left. He said it the way he'd said every order in 47 engagements. Calm, certain, built on a doctrine that had never once needed revision. That certainty was the thing Vosgale had spent 11 days building a war around. A fleet commander who trusted his models completely would keep trusting them one order too long. She was counting on it the way she counted names in a journal, patiently, and to the end. He's going to hold position, she said. He doesn't have a category for retreat this early. His doctrine doesn't have a chapter for losing. And if he adapts faster than we think, then we'll find out how good our backup plan is. She almost smiled. We don't have one. That's how good I think the first plan is. A petty officer brought coffee to the bridge without being asked, the same one who'd asked her about it back at Kestrel. She took the cup and didn't drink it. Beside her, Okafor's voice came through the channel, steady, waiting. Fire control primed, Admiral. Standing by on your mark, same as before. Not yet. She set the coffee down, untouched, and reached into her coat instead. Her thumb found the spine of the journal, the same worn groove it always found, and she left it there a moment before letting her hand fall back to the console. It wasn't superstition. It was just the shape her hands knew how to make before something like this. Ray's noticed. He always noticed. You do that every time. I do a lot of things every time, she said. Habits are just decisions you've already made once. The Karath second wave, still fractured, still deaf to half its own orders, began consolidating on Varath Kor's flagship in a slow, defensive knot. It was the correct maneuver. It was also exactly the shape Vosgale had spent 11 days hoping he'd choose, because a knot of ships holds still, and a still target is the only kind her next order needed. Commander, his sensor officer said, the unknown contact has stopped closing. It's holding at extreme range. Varath Kor's crest cycled toward a color his crew had learned meant he was thinking, not deciding. Why would it stop? Nobody answered him, because nobody on that bridge had ever seen a weapon that needed distance instead of proximity to be devastating. And there was no chapter in 3 centuries of doctrine that explained why an enemy would want to stand farther away right before attacking. At 22:41 ship time, a transmission reached the meridian from a source Rays didn't recognize, routed through 3 relay buoys and badly degraded by the time it arrived. He read it twice before he brought it to Vosgale. Admiral, Fleet Intelligence confirms it. The 47 civilians the Karath detained from the Horizon's Promise Conv, they're still alive, held at a secondary Karath installation inside the corridor, not recovered, not accounted for in any of our targeting solutions. Vosgale went very still. 47 names she hadn't written yet, because until this moment she had believed every person from that conv was already lost, already entered into her journal as ink instead of a person who might still walk off a ship someday. The number she'd been carrying as a closed grief was, without warning, an open question again. Where, she said, not a question, a demand. Location unclear. The installation isn't part of the primary formation. If this engagement goes the way we've planned it, then it might not survive the plan. She looked at the display, at the scattered Karath ships, at the installation's approximate coordinates now blinking somewhere at the edge of the engagement zone, well within the blast radius of anything the Vindicator was built to fire. Get me exact coordinates, now, before I give another order. The mundane beat that steadied her, the coffee she still hadn't drunk, cooling by her elbow, sat there through the next 4 minutes while 3 separate officers worked to isolate a set of coordinates from data that had never been meant to resolve that precisely. Nobody spoke above a working murmur. She didn't touch the journal again. She didn't need to. She already knew what she'd write in it if this went wrong. Coordinates confirmed, the sensor officer finally said. Outside the primary strike radius, Vindicator fire solution unaffected. Vosgale let a breath go that she hadn't realized she was holding. Good, she said. Then nobody else gets added to that installation's casualty count today, only to its rescue list. She looked at the display one more time. 240 ships consolidating into a single defensive knot. A captain who did not know retreat was an option this early, and 47 people somewhere in the dark who had just become the entire reason any of this mattered. Vindicator, she said into the fleet channel. Prepare to fire. She waited, she watched. She said, not yet. Not yet, she said again, and the bridge held its breath around her. Ray's voice was low. Admiral, the window on this shot won't stay open forever. His formation is already reconsolidating. I know. She watched the coordinates blink at the edge of the strike radius. 3 officers' work compressed into a single confirmed point in the dark. I'm not waiting for the shot. I'm waiting for confirmation that the people inside that installation are far enough from it to still be people when this is over. The confirmation came 4 minutes later, relayed through a voice she didn't recognize and would never learn the name of. Structural distance, sufficient. Survivors, unharmed as of last contact. She let out a breath she'd been holding since Partition 3. Vindicator, she said. Fire. 4.2 kilometers of hull that had never fired a shot at anything that could shoot back, discharged its primary weapons into the dark, and the volume of space it covered would have swallowed a conventional fleet twice over. Varathkor's consolidated formation, the knot of ships he had gathered around himself in the one maneuver his doctrine still trusted, did not so much break as stop existing as a shape at all. His crest went a color his own crew had never seen on him before, in 47 engagements, in 3 centuries of expansion. "Casualties," he said. Nobody answered right away. When his sensor officer finally spoke, her voice had lost the last of its steadiness. "Commander, we don't have a number. We have a direction things used to be." Varathkor looked at the tactical plot. 240 ships. Now something closer to a scatter of debris and a handful of stragglers running for any gap in a corridor his doctrine had guaranteed him 3 centuries ago would never need one. His doctrine had never failed. It had never needed to adapt because nothing had ever forced it to. He had no chapter for this. He had no order that fit. For the first time in his career, Varathkor reached for a code he had only ever read about in old archives, never transmitted, never expected to need. "Send the evacuation signal," he said. "All ships still capable, withdraw." No Karath commander had ever given that order in 300 years. On the meridian, Vosgale watched the number on her display stop climbing and start settling. Not 0, not everyone. A cluster of ships peeling away from the wreck of a fleet, running for the far edge of the corridor. "Hold fire," she said. "All ships, let them go." Reyes turned toward her. "Admiral, we could finish it here, right now. There won't be a second chance like this." "There won't need to be a second chance." She kept her eyes on the display. "They'll report back. That's the whole point. I don't need every ship gone. I need every ship that's left to go home and tell the rest of the Dominion exactly what they saw." 22 minutes. That was all it had taken, start to finish. From the moment the Vindicator broke silence to the moment Varathkor's fleet stopped being a fleet at all. She reached into her coat and found the journal, and this time she did take it out. She didn't open it yet. She just set it on the console, a weight against the numbers on the screen, the way she always needed it there before she let herself feel anything about what the numbers meant. The rescue teams reached the detained installation 9 hours later. Vosgale was on the Meridian's bridge when the first confirmation came through, not a number this time, a name. The first of many, the intelligence officer began reading aloud, because Vosgale had asked him to read them, not just report them. She listened to everyone. The Karath Supreme Council's transmission arrived 2 days after that, the first time in the entire conflict they had asked to talk instead of demanding. Reyes read it over her shoulder. "They're scared," he said. "Good," Vosgale said. "Let them understand exactly what they were looking at." At Neutral Station Fringe, she sat across a table from a delegation whose crest patterns she still couldn't fully read, and laid out conditions that were shorter than anyone on her own staff had expected. Open corridor, no further incursions, full accounting, going forward, of every ship that crossed it. The Karath delegation accepted without the count negotiation her staff had drafted contingencies for. Afterward, alone in the transport back to Kestrel, she finally opened the journal. The 47 survivors came home 5 days later, a slow procession of shuttles docking one at a time at Waypoint Kestrel, and Vosgale stood at the bay for 4 hours and met every single one of them at the airlock. She didn't have a speech. She shook hands. She asked names she already knew from the manifest, the way she'd read them once before in a hallway outside Webb's office, back when they were only entries in someone else's tragedy. An old man limping off the last shuttle stopped in front of her and said, "You're the one who counted us." "I count everyone," she said. "It's just that this time I get to write something better than a date." He didn't ask what she meant. He just nodded, the way people do when they already understand. That night, she sat alone with the journal open on her desk. 41 names, written in the days after the Horizon's promise first went dark, still there on the earlier pages, ink she would never soften or explain away. She turned to a fresh page and began to write the names of the people who had walked off those shuttles today, one at a time, the same care she'd have given if the news had gone the other way. Below the last name, She wrote a single word. Returned. She closed the journal and set it on the desk beside nothing else. Not lighter, just carried differently now. Outside, past the viewport, the Kethar corridor sat open and dark and quiet, a road again instead of a grave, and somewhere along it, a cargo hauler crossed the old kill zone without an escort for the first time in 4 months, carrying nothing more dramatic than freight and people who wanted to get where they were going. Voscale watched its transponder blink once on her display and left it there.